Welcome to the second edition of Deccan Herald Spotlight, a fresh series of debates and discussions to better understand and interpret our world. We've gathered here today to discuss the polarization of American politics, and to take this event forward, may I please request Mr. Chaitanya Netkalappa, Management Executive, Printers Mysore Private Limited, to come up on stage and share a few words.
Thank you, Piali. It has been close to 4 months since the US presidential elections amazed the world over. And we are still grappling with how, why, and what, that led to this historic decision. As partisan politics in America takes an interesting turn, one cannot help but wonder about the causes that may have led to the present state. To help give perspective on this interesting dimension in US politics, we have with us Professor John Mark Hansen, a noted US American scholar. Professor Hansen is Charles L. Hutchinson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. He's also the faculty director of the U-Chicago Center in Delhi and is one of the nation's leading scholars of American politics. Hansen, whose research has focused on interest groups, research activism, and public opinion, is the author of 2 books, Mobilization, Participation, and Democracy in America, and Gaining Access, Congress, and the Farm Lobby, 1919 to 1981. In 1999, he received the Heinz Eulo Award from the American Political Science Association and the Best Article published in the American Political Science Review in 1998. He also received the Outstanding Book Award from the National Conference of Blank Political Scientists for Mobilization, Participation, and Democracy in America in 1995. In 2003, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Professor John Mark Hansen.
Introduction, and thank you all of you for being here. Thank you for the Deccan Herald for making this possible. I'm a data guy, and we're going to have a bunch of slides, and so if anyone feels the need to kind of move closer to the center, this would probably be a good time to do that. Let's see, somewhere or other the presentation is going to come up. Okay. So the color coding of US politics began in 2000. That, of course, was the historic election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, where for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, we got to wonder what the outcome of the election actually was. That particular election year, commentators had color-coded the electoral map, where red stood for Republicans and blue stood for Democrats. And that color coding has kind of become part and parcel of the discourse of American politics ever since. And in fact, what it does really is to kind of encapsulate or to symbolize a very deep division within the US electorate between the 2 political parties. So what I'm going to speak on today is partisan polarization, in particular about kind of what form it takes both in Washington and in the electorate. And I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about how partisan polarization led us to the 2016 election and to the first few months of the Donald Trump administration. Let me begin by giving you a few signs of our divisions. So first of all, I'm going to start with a listing of presidential success in legislation. This is basically the percentage of policies or the percentage of pieces of legislation on which the president took a position that was passed either by the Senate or by the House. And I want to call your attention to a couple different things. The first is that there are 2 different chambers here. There's the House and the Senate. That's the dotted line, the House, and the solid line, the dotted line is the Senate, and the solid line is the House. And as you can see, back in the Eisenhower administration, back in the 1950s, there wasn't too much difference across the years in the percentage of legislation that was passed, even though it was the case that the Eisenhower administration worked with a Republican Congress for just the first 2 years of the administration, and the last 6 years were working with a Democratic administration. If you then fast forward to the last two presidents, to George W. Bush and to Barack Obama, you can see that there's an enormous difference between the periods where the president had a party of his own in control of Congress and the years where the opposition party controlled the Congress. And so George W. Bush looks like a world beater in the first several years of his term. Barack Obama, in fact, had the most success of any president in enacting his legislative program in 2009. And by the time he left office, with facing both houses of Congress in control of the Republicans, he was among the least successful Republican presidents, or excuse me, least successful presidents in getting his legislation passed into law. Another sign of our division is partisan support on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate for the president's program. So this is the same kind of thing on those policies on which the president took a stand. What percentage of Republicans in red and what percentage of Democrats in blue supported the policy of the president? And you can see back there in the 1950s and 1960s, during the Eisenhower administration, even during the Kennedy-Johnson administration and the Nixon administration, there wasn't that much difference in the level of support that the Republicans and the Democrats gave to the policies of the President of the United States. And once again, fast forward to the last two administrations, to the George W. Bush administration and to the Obama administration, it matters a heck of a lot whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Democrats supported Obama's policies by over 80% of the time, and Republicans supported Obama's policies less than 30% of the time. So this is same is true in the United States Senate. Don't necessarily want to say a whole lot about that, but the important thing to note here is that the support of the president's own party for the president's policies has been increasing over time, and the support of the opposition party for the president's policies has been falling over time. What this suggests then is that the importance of political party and the importance of partisanship has been rising in U.S. politics. And so what I want to do in most of the talk, in most of the next few minutes, is to give you a sense of kind of what's underneath that. Sort of why is it that the parties are so polarized? What's behind that difference between Republicans and Democrats over policy? So I'm going to talk about party divisions. I'm also going to talk about party support. Indeed, the incidence of party unity votes in the United States Congress has been rising over the last couple of decades, over the last 3 decades or so. What party unity votes are votes where a majority of Republicans votes against a majority of Democrats. Okay, so these are instances where the two parties, in fact, are divided over policy, majority of Republicans against a majority of Democrats. And as you can see, there was a time, and I have a pointer here somewhere, there was a time back in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, when there weren't all that many party unity votes. Less than 50% of the time, the votes had a majority of Democrats opposed to a majority of Republicans. And that incidence of party unity votes has been rising, so that now it's the case that about 2/3 of the time, a majority of Democrats opposes a majority of Republicans. So this is a sign of our division. It's also the case that on party unity votes, the parties are more united on party unity votes than they have been in the past. So when a majority of Democrats opposes a majority of Republicans, it's more often the case that a supermajority, a very large majority of Democrats opposes a very large majority of Republicans. Here the two lines are for Democrats and for Republicans, on the left for the House and on the right for the United States Senate. And as you can see, the incidence of party voting, the likelihood that a member of the Democratic Party or Republican Party will support his or her own party on party unity votes has gone from about 70% in the early 1970s to close to 90% in the in the early couple decades of this century. So what lies underneath this? Well, I'm going to make the case that in Congress and more generally in our government, the political parties have both gotten further apart. And what I mean by further apart is further apart in their policy views or their ideological points of view. And moreover, the two parties have become more homogeneous. That is, they have much more in common with each other. Democrats have much more in common with each other on party on policy matters than they did before, and Republicans have much more in common with each other than they did in years past. One way of showing this is by looking at the average party position in the House and the Senate. So what we have here on the vertical axis is a liberal on the low end to conservative on the high end estimation of the ideology, if you will, or the policy positions of members of the House of Representatives in this particular case. What it shows, of course, is that Republicans, which unfortunately are in blue this time, and Democrats, which unfortunately are in red, what it shows is that Democrats and Republicans, the kind of the average policy position of Democratic representatives and Republican representatives has diverged quite sharply starting in the early 1980s. If you look carefully, what you'll see is that a lot of the change, not all of it, but a lot of the change is accounted for by Republicans who have moved very far to the right in the United States House of Representatives relative to Democrats who have moved a bit to the left, but a bit to the left only relative to the early 1940s, which is about the middle of that graph. So we've seen a kind of divergence of the two political parties. The average Republican is now a very conservative Republican, and the average Democrat is a fairly liberal Democrat. And the same is true again on the Senate side of the aisle, or the Senate side of the Capitol. Where these come from, by the way, is that these policy positions are estimated from roll call votes, from recorded votes, and basically it's a big scaling operation where all of the members of Congress are sort of arrayed from left to right on these votes because of the way that they cast their votes. Finally, so this is evidence of the divergence of the two parties. The two parties are further apart in their policy views than they were in the past. Moreover, they're also more homogeneous in the sense that they really are distinct from each other in their ideological points of view. So the data here are the same. This time we have histograms, so we have the distribution of the policy positions among members of Congress. On the left-hand side is the 90th Congress, which began to meet in 1967 and met from 67 to 69. And on the right-hand side, we have the ideological distribution of the 110th Congress, which met from 2007 to 2009. So about a 30-year difference in these two Congresses. On the left-hand side, that you can see, first of all, that unsurprisingly, Democrats are more liberal than Republicans on the whole, and Republicans are more conservative than Democrats on the whole. The other thing that you can easily observe, however, is that the two memberships overlap each other. That there are a fair number, there are an especially large number actually of conservative Democrats, Democrats, in fact, who are pretty far right, even relative to Republicans. And there are a smaller number, but still significant number of more moderate or liberal Republicans. And so there's overlap in the ideological sort of composition of the two party coalitions in Congress. When we look on the right-hand side, what we see is that there is no middle anymore. There is no overlap. The most conservative Democrat in the United States House is more liberal than the most liberal Republican, and that's been the case since the late 1990s. In the Senate, the same thing is true, it just happened later. Okay, the most conservative Senate Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Senate Republican, and it's been that way since Arlen Specter switched parties in the early years of the Bush administration. So not only have they gotten to be further apart, they've also gotten to be more homogeneous. They're more sort of internally cohesive than they used to be. And that's what gives rise to what we've just observed. Okay, these high rates of support for the president of one's own party and very low rates of support in both the House and the Senate for presidents of the opposite party. It turns out that this phenomenon also generalizes to the electorate. So the American electorate over this time period has also become further apart in its policy views, and it has also become more homogeneous in its policy views. That is, each of the parties has become more homogeneous over time. Now, Americans, of course, do not formally have party membership. It's not like many countries where you have to be a kind of enrolled member. In some states, you might have to declare that you're a Republican or Democrat in order to participate in the primary, but there's no sort of formal membership in U.S. political parties. And so the way that we identify who's a Republican and who's a Democrat is by asking a survey question. This is from one of the longest running national surveys, the American National Election Studies. And you'll see basically that it asks the question whether people think of themselves as a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or what. My comment on this is no one ever answers what. Okay, everybody answers one of those first three. And then, depending upon whether they answer that they're a Republican or a Democrat on the one hand or an independent on the other, if they answer that they're a Republican or a Democrat, they're basically asked for the strength of their commitment to the Democratic or the Republican Party. And if they are an independent, they're asked whether they think of themselves primarily as being leaning toward the Republicans or leaning toward the Democrats. This is an important distinction. I won't necessarily get into it, what you find in particular is that among independents, that is among people who say that they're independents, it turns out that about 80% of them lean to the Republican Party or lean to the Democratic Party, and their behavior in election choice is exactly the same as weak partisans. Okay, so a whole lot of this hullabaloo about how more Americans are becoming more independent, no. Independence has actually been going down in the electorate. And you can see that in this graph. This shows the proportion of the American electorate that identifies as Democrats in blue, as Republicans in red, and as independents without leanings either to the Republican Party or to the Democratic Party in green. The important thing to note here is that partisan identification with the Democratic Party has been declining over the entire period, although it has slowed down and is essentially flat for about the last 25 years or 30 years. Republican identification increased, and the biggest changes were in the early 1980s during the Reagan administration. So the two claims I want to make, though, are that the two parties have moved apart. The two parties in the electorate have moved apart. Republicans and Democrats have less in common with each other than they did before in their policy views, and moreover, the party coalitions in the electorate have become more homogeneous. In terms of their moving apart, here we have another sort of survey question from the American National Election Studies asking about ideology. So we ask people basically, do you think of yourself as a liberal or conservative or a moderate? And there are a bunch of variations on this. And as you can see over this 30-year period between 1972 and 1976 on the left and 2004 and 2008 on the right, there are three main things to note. The first is that the middle has shrunk. There are fewer people in the exact middle of the distribution who call themselves out-and-out moderates or middle-of-the-road voters. The number of people who call themselves conservatives has increased a bit over this time, and there's even a small increase in the percentage who call themselves liberals. So there's been a bit of a kind of rightward tilt in the American electorate over this 30-year period, and a decline in the middle. More importantly, the relationship between ideology and the partisan identification has changed markedly over this time. So now what I've done is to separate Republicans from Democrats, looking at their ideological positionings. On the left-hand side, it's quite interesting. In the 1970s, both parties were essentially centrist parties. Okay, the Republicans were conservative, right? There were more Republican conservatives, certainly, than there were Republican liberals. And likewise, the Democratic Party was liberal in the sense that there were more liberals and fewer conservatives in the two parties. But both of the parties had most of their people in the middle, and there weren't extremes in either party, or there weren't very many extremes in either party. And when we fast forward 30 years to 2004 to 2008, what we find is that the Democrats are a distinctly liberal party, even though there remain a good fraction of Democrats who call themselves conservatives. Democrats are a liberal party, and especially, and even more so, Republicans are a conservative party and see themselves very much as a conservative party. So what we've seen then, once again, is a separation of the two parties in the electorate and a homogenization of the two parties in the electorate. That is, whereas there were a fair number of Republican liberals and moderates in the 1970s. There are very few Republican liberals and almost no moderates in the 2000s. And likewise, while there were a lot of moderate and conservative Democrats in the 1970s, there are relatively few conservative Democrats in the 2000s. So what are the consequences? Well, one consequence of this is that there is a closer relationship between ideology and the way that people cast their votes in national elections. So this graph is for House elections. The top two lines, the two lines in both cases are from two different sources. So it's basically just sort of two different survey sources. In the top, what we see is that liberals have slightly increased the likelihood of choosing the Democratic nominee for the U.S. House. But what we see in the bottom, and especially this occurs in the early 1990s, is that the proportion of conservatives who choose the Democratic nominee has dropped from about a third to about 1 in 5. And so there's a greater correspondence between people's voting behavior, between their vote choices and the party that they and the ideology that they profess. Likewise, we've seen an increase in party loyalty and voter choice. So here the solid line is voting in presidential elections. The kind of dotted line is in Senate elections, and then the dashed line is in House elections. And once again, what we see is in the early 1970s, there was much less party loyalty. That is, Democrats were pretty likely, actually, to vote for Republicans in House elections and in Senate elections and presidential elections. And Republicans were fairly likely to vote for Democratic candidates in House, Senate, and presidential elections. Now what we've seen is a new high. 85% of Democrats and Republicans voted for the party of their, voted for the candidate of their own party in the 2008 and the 2012 elections. And similarly on the House and the Senate side. So we've seen an increase in party loyalty in presidential and congressional elections. In presidential elections in particular, this is looking at all Democrats and breaking down the percentage who voted for the Democratic nominee in blue. And unsurprisingly, most Democrats all through this period have voted for Democrats. But we can also see that in the 1970s into the early 1980s, there were a fair fraction of Democrats who voted for the Republican nominee, here in red, and a few for third-party nominees, particularly in 1992 and 1996 when Ross Perot ran against the first George Bush and Bill Clinton. On the Republican side, Republicans have always been more loyal to their nominees than Democrats have been. And so we don't see a whole lot of difference over time. We see a little bit of attraction to third-party candidates in 1992 and 1996. But the overall message here is that there's greater and greater and greater loyalty in elections to the nominee of one's own party than there have been in the past. And how does this play out in national politics? Well, one way to get a sense of how this plays out in national politics is to look at the approval of the job that the president is doing by political party. So since the 1930s, the Gallup organization has asked the question, do you approve or disapprove of the job that President Trump is doing as president? Okay, and people can say I approve or they disapprove or what have you. It's consistent. It goes way back, in this case, to Harry Truman is the first one on the far left, all the way up to Obama. And the thing to notice here is that in the 1950s and the early 1960s, while there was a difference in presidential approval, right, Democrats were more likely to approve the job that a Democratic president is doing than the job a Republican president is doing, and Republicans are more likely to approve the job that a Republican is doing relative to the job that a Democrat is doing. That gap has widened. In fact, it's widened from about a 30-point gap in the Eisenhower years to a 65 percentage point gap in the Bush and Obama years. So basically what we have is a situation where voters are more loyal to the candidates of their own party, and voters tend to evaluate the job that the president is doing and many, many, many other things through the lens of their partisanship. Okay, they look on the president as a partisan figure, and they basically ask themselves, not really how good a job is he doing, but I know how good a job he's doing. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat, he's doing a terrible job, right? Or he's a Republican, I'm a Republican, he's doing a great job. Okay. So I'm going to skip over a section on kind of the sources of polarization and kind of take us up to the current moment. The current moment of polarized politics. What I've shown you is a 50-year change in U.S. policy, in U.S. politics, whereby the two parties in Congress have gotten further apart and more homogeneous, and the two parties in the electorate have gotten further apart and more homogeneous. I've also shown you what the implications of that are for the kinds of choices that they make, both the way that they vote in Congress, okay, where we know that the two parties are more loyal to their party leadership, or more loyal to their parties in those votes than they were 40 or 50 years ago, and in their votes in the electorate, in their votes for president, for the House, and for the Senate. Democrats are more loyal to Democrats, Republicans are more loyal to Republicans than they used to be in the past. So the argument I'm going to make to close out my remarks is twofold. The first is that the first claim I want to make is that partisan polarization was a big factor in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And in fact, one could make the argument that if the parties were not so polarized, Donald Trump would not have been able to be elected president in 2016. And the second claim I want to make and to document is that partisan polarization has been a big factor in sustaining Donald Trump in this first 6 weeks of his administration, that Donald Trump would be in a lot deeper trouble if not for the operation of polarized politics in U.S. politics. So Trump was as a candidate, and I want to set aside in particular all the things that actually happened during the campaign that got people all riled up. So I want to kind of leave aside the attacks on a respected senator and a federal judge, the expressions of bigotry, the threat to lock up his opponent, the Access Hollywood tape where he boasted about getting away with various terrible behavior toward women. And finally, I want to get away from the suggestion that he might not recognize the legitimacy of the outcome if he happened to lose the election. So all those things certainly happen. What I'm going to argue is that, surprisingly, none of that made any difference, right? And the reason it didn't make any difference was because of partisan polarization. That will be my argument. So Donald Trump is a very unusual candidate, even leaving aside all of the outrages or grand moments, if you like, if you're on the other side during the campaign. For one thing, he was only the second nominee in U.S. presidential election history who had no previous experience in government or the military at all. The only previous nominee who had no previous government experience was Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee in 1940. Also among presidents, he's very unusual. There have been only two presidents in U.S. history up until Donald Trump who had neither previous elective office nor high military command. And they were William Howard Taft, who served between Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the early part of the 20th century, and Herbert Hoover, the predecessor of Franklin Roosevelt. But both Taft and Hoover had considerable governmental experience, but in appointed office. So Taft had been a Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals judge, he'd been Secretary of State, he'd been military governor of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and Herbert Hoover had been Commerce Secretary for 8 years. He was War Food Administrator, and he was War Relief Administrator after World War I. So these were people who had lots and lots of experience. Donald Trump had not even been elected condo president, okay? No experience in elective office at all. Moreover, money is oftentimes taken to be of enormous importance in U.S. presidential elections. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump's campaign by about a 2-to-1 margin. So this is accounting, I believe it comes from the Washington Post or from Bloomberg, I don't remember exactly what, But Hillary Clinton spent slightly more in her campaign than separately Barack Obama and Mitt Romney did in 2012, about $1.2 billion. In the election campaign, Donald Trump spent $647 million in that campaign. So despite not having any previous experience and despite being outspent by a considerable margin, Donald Trump still ended up winning the election. And why is that? Well, I want to take you back to this slide. The reason that Donald Trump won the presidential election is because Republicans supported Donald Trump to about the same extent that they supported previous Republican nominees. Simple as that. The percentage of Republicans who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 was about the same as the percentage who voted for John McCain in 2008, for George W. Bush in 2004, and for Mitt Romney in 2012. So the kind of increased partisan loyalty, the increased party loyalty that has come about in this polarized environment played a very, very important role in this campaign. In the end, Republicans simply couldn't vote for someone who was not a Republican. And despite all the gyrations in the polls, and here are the gyrations in the polls, despite all the gyrations in the polls, eventually Republicans got their heads around the notion that I should support the nominee of my own party. They managed to justify it to themselves, oftentimes by saying, well, I don't really like Trump very much, but I don't like Hillary Clinton at all, right? So the polarization of American politics, I think, has played a very important role in the rise of Donald Trump. And what about the presidency of Donald Trump? Well, here's Donald Trump's approval rating from the Gallup organization. This is the same approval rating that I talked about a little bit earlier, asking people, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing as president? And as you can see, Americans disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing as presidency by about a 52 or 53% to about a 45% margin. As you can see, there was a brief time right after Inauguration Day where there were slightly more of the American public who approved of Donald Trump's performance, his not having performed anything, given that he was just inaugurated, than who disapproved. But that was Donald Trump's honeymoon right there. It lasted for about a week. And since then, Donald Trump has had the lowest public approval ratings early term than any American president. So these are the most recent comparisons from Gallup. This is a month into the term, so this comes from late February. And comparing Donald Trump to the previous newly elected presidents, starting with President Eisenhower. So as you can see, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton faced some considerable scrutiny or some considerable skepticism when they first became president. Reagan approved by about 55% of the American electorate in job performance a month in. Clinton just barely over 50%. And Donald Trump a month in is at 40% approval, according to the regular Gallup poll. And why is that? Well, the reason for that is because he draws his support entirely from Republicans. Okay. So this is that same job approval, but divided by whether people see themselves or say that they are Democrats in blue, independents in green, or Republicans in red. As you can see, back in the good old days, in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Nixon years, there really wasn't that much difference. I mean, there was a difference, right? I mean, Republicans are more likely to approve the performance of Eisenhower a month in. Republicans are more ready to approve the performance of Nixon a month in. Democrats were more ready to support Kennedy a month in, and so forth. But if you look, particularly starting with the Bill Clinton administration, the fourth one from the right, the second, George W. Bush, that difference has become a chasm. And now we see an even wider chasm. So that little blue bar there at the bottom are the 8% of Democrats who approve the job performance of President Trump. That green bar is the 34% of independents who approve the job performance of Donald Trump. And that high red bar are the 87% of Republicans who support the job performance of Donald Trump. And this is what's sustaining the Trump administration right now, is that his party controls Congress. He is very popular. He has very high approval among the members of the Republican Party, among voters in the Republican Party. And as long as that approval remains high, it's going to mean that Republican office holders have to be very careful about supporting Donald Trump. And why is it that so many Republicans support Donald Trump? The simple answer is he's a Republican. That's the entire answer, right? The entire answer is he's a Republican, and you can in fact see that as Trump became more and more likely to be president, his favorability, this is a different Gallup question, asking people whether they have a favorable or an unfavorable impression of Donald Trump. As you can see, at every step along the way, that favorability went up. So there on the left, that tick up between April and May is when it became very clear that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. That tick up in September is the convention bounce, when he was officially made the nominee of the Republican Party. And then finally, the rise right there at the end was his election as president. And so this is a phenomenon essentially where Republicans are rallying around a Republican president, and in that way, partisan polarization continuing to play a very, very strong role in U.S. politics. So I hope I've convinced you that this is an important phenomenon, perhaps even a worrisome phenomenon, and I look forward to our discussion in just a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I would now like to call on stage Mr. Sugata Srinivasaraju, an award-winning journalist, writer, and translator. Sugata is currently the co-founder and vice chairman of Sunoscapes Radio Foundation and was earlier editorial director and editor-in-chief of AsiaNet News Network. He was also editor-in-chief of Vijay Karnataka, and he started his career with Deccan Herald. He was awarded the British Chevening Scholarship in 2000 for excellence in print journalism and became an India Leadership Fellow at the Aspen Institute in 2008. From 2011, he has been the Aspen Global Leadership Network Fellow.
Hi, good evening everybody, and happy to see a lot of Bangaloreans interested in Trump and American politics. But I just want to begin by, because it's a University of Chicago event, face each other? Okay. Posing questions to Professor Hansen. Because it's a University of Chicago event and being held in Bangalore, I just want to, I've discovered three big connections between Karnataka and Chicago, specifically the University of Chicago. So I'll just give you a brief thing on these three discoveries that I've made. One is the University of Mysore, which is just about celebrating its, I think it was last year, it celebrated its centenary year, was modeled after the University of Chicago. There were two gentlemen who were sent on a long trip across the globe by the then Maharaja of Mysore. And one of them was C.R. Reddy, and the other one was a British gentleman called Thomas Denham. So they go around the globe and they decide that they should model the University of Mysore on the University of Chicago. And a small portion of the Mysore University was also modeled on the University of Wisconsin. Say, if 60% was University of Chicago, 20% was Wisconsin, another 20%, very surprisingly in colonial India, was modeled on Oxford and Cambridge. So that was just 20%. So that is one very big thing. One very big connection that I discovered. And I'm very happy to sort of let you know about that, and probably you should advertise about that. The second thing is about the great writer A.K. Ramanujan. Mr. Karnad is here and he would vouch for me. He's a Mysorean, a Bangalorean, and we would like to call him a Kannada writer, but he was very much your professor. So Ramanujan was the great connect between Karnataka and University of Chicago. And the third one, which is very interesting, is also related to Ramanujan, but not directly. If you read this 23-page long profile written by Lawrence Weschler on the discovery of Harold Shapinski way back in the 80s, 85 or there was a gentleman from Bangalore called Akumal Ramchandar who meets David Shapinski, the son of Harold Shapinski, who was a great abstract expressionist, at the library in University of Chicago for the first time. So it's the Regenstein Library which became the beginning point for the discovery of Harold Shapinski, and he then became a legend and became part of, the whole big abstract expressionist movement. So these are the three big things that I discovered about University of Chicago. So after all the gloom about the Trump politics, I thought I should just cheer the crowd up a little before we move into American politics. So, and we're also discussing American politics in a very somber kind of situation, because America has always been good news for India. In fact, the Indian dream has been supplanted by the American dream. But what we are seeing happen today is really worrisome, as you said. And going by the slides that you sort of presented, I think it's very, very clear that the middle has completely vanished. So is there any which way in which we could reconstruct the middle? I think, you also mentioned that while you were presenting your slides, that it was not always so. I think before the 60s, and the Democrats had a bit of conservatives in them, and also the liberals, and I think only after 65, if I'm right, that the Democrats became a civil rights party, and the kind of polarization started. So is there any hope? Because it looks very worrisome and very negative. Is there any hope at all for this kind of middle reconstruction in American politics?
Well, first, let me say a little bit about why we had this situation in mid-century where there was this overlap between two parties. The overlap was primarily a regional overlap. Many of the conservatives were Southerners, and they, because of the United States Civil War, were very committed to the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the party of the Union, party of Lincoln, party that freed the slaves, and so on and so forth. And so for a very long time, we had an overlay of this regional cleavage, North versus South, on the kind of standard left-right cleavage in American politics, kind of soft class cleavage that we observe in American politics. And so it was pretty easy in that particular case for Southern Democrats to make common cause with moderate Republicans in kind of realizing their objectives. Can we get it back? Well, that regional overlay is completely gone now. If anything, it's in the opposite. We oftentimes, or we frequently in recent periods, have observed a Republican solid South. During the Reagan years and the first Bush administration, we had a situation where all the southern states voted Republican. That's breaking down now, I think, and I think we're likely to have a much more competitive South than it was in the past. But those old days of that regional cleavage overlaying the class cleavage are just gone forever. However, I think the hope for a moderation of polarization has to do with demographic changes in the American electorate. And two in particular. One is that one of the things that's always difficult to keep in mind when you're talking about an electorate is that when you talk about the electorate in 1980 is different from the electorate in 2010, because there are people who were in the electorate in 1980 who are no longer in the electorate in 2010 because they've died or they've moved away or they've dropped out or what have you. And there are people who were not eligible to be in the electorate in 1980 who in 2012 are able to vote for the first time, or they're naturalized and they're able to vote. They've reached the age of franchise. And there are two things that are happening. Both of them are to the advantage of the Democrats. The first is what I call the Hispanicization of the American electorate. And actually you can include in that Asians. So we saw the largest immigration to the United States between, say, 1980 and 2010, the largest immigration in the United States since the late 19th century. And the new immigrant populations that are rising are very democratic so far in their voting proclivities. Latinos vote about 2-to-1 Democratic. And in 2012, the Asians were even more loyal to the Democratic Party than Latinos were. The second is, and it's related, is that for a 50-year period, every generation that entered the electorate was more Republican and less Democratic than the generation that preceded it. And
that's going to change now.
And that's now turned around. Right. So starting right after the peak Republican generation is the late baby boom generation, which actually includes Barack Obama. And ever since that cohort, the cohorts are now moving back in the other direction, so that now it's the case that every generation that's entering politics is more liberal and more democratic in its voting, which to me means that the Republicans are going to have to reposition themselves, and that will bring them closer to the center.
But Professor Hansen, do you see this vanishing of the middle as a global phenomenon?
Mm-hmm.
Because in India, I mean, we have started speaking in terms of polarization. You know, it's us versus them has become very, very prominent, and that was the basis on which the 2014 elections were fought. And going back to what Bush said, you're with us or against us, kind of an argument has entered mainstream political discourse in India as well. And you see that happening in other places as well. Can you just throw light on what's happening globally, you know, in partisanship, polarization, is that mainstream now? Because you said all of this will change with the demographic shift.
Right.
But the demographic shift is going to take a lot of time. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not really an expert on politics outside the United States, so I'm actually quite interested to hear what all of you have to say about polarization in India and in other parts of the world. I do think that's right. In thinking a bit about what might be driving it, there are certainly some common things that are happening around the world that I think increase the stresses and kind of make social conflict deeper and more intense than it was before. Part of that is immigration, and in particular the kind of forced immigration because of conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well. And the other piece, I think, is the slowdown of economic growth in the West, which simply means that the competition between different classes, between different people for resources has gotten a lot more intense. So I think, you know, the impression's right, and I think it's partly because there are some common stresses.
But I don't know if the American press has told you this, but the recce for Trump's 2015-16 election was held in India in 2014 and 13 and 14. So we are not at all surprised when the American press speaks about fake news or anti-minority stuff or all of that. Have you followed Indian politics at all?
Well, I would say my second visit to India was to participate in a panel with the former head of the Indian Election Commission, Mr. Navin Chawla, where we talked about election administration. So I was actually here during the 2014 elections.
2014 elections.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't say.
But was the polarization palpable to you at that time?
Well, I was certainly aware of it, and in particular, kind of aware of how controversial Mr. Modi has been within India. Right.
If coming to the Indian immigrants in America, I mean, they've been very vocal in their support for Trump.
Yeah.
And in the last fortnight or so, we have seen 3 very, very unfortunate incidents. So do you think that's going to change the way the Indian immigrant in America is going to approach the Trump administration? You know, because this is a reflection of the polarization of... Yeah? Yes, sorry. So this is some kind of a reflection... Yeah, that's better. Thank you. So is that some kind of a reflection on the polarization of American politics? Will the manner in which these people look at the Trump administration now, 6 months after they've wholeheartedly supported him, is that going to change?
Well, first of all, I think I want to challenge the premise of the question in part. I know that there were a number of Indian Americans who were very prominent supporters of Donald Trump and very enthusiastic for Donald Trump. I also know that, in particular, the Hindu Nationalist Party here in India was very favorable toward Donald Trump and made it very clear that they were favorable toward Donald Trump. By the same token, historically, Indian Americans have actually been more democratic than even other Asian voting groups. My sense is largely because of the inheritance of the Congress Party and the kind of greater friendliness to more liberal economic policies. The incidents that have occurred recently, it is certainly the case that the president has played a role in heightening ethnic tensions. It's also the case that many people in the United States have a hard time telling one brown-skinned person from another brown-skinned person. You'll remember in 2001, after the 9/11 tragedy, there was a Sikh man who was murdered, I believe, in Houston, and which was roundly condemned by the Bush administration. Is that going to cause a decline in support for Trump among Indian Americans? It's certainly possible. On the other hand, there have been similar concerns that have been raised by American Jews who have cited a rise in anti-Semitism and attacks on synagogues and Jewish cemeteries and so forth, which doesn't seem to have really registered among Trump's Jewish supporters, especially the extremely pro-Israel, kind of theologically conservative Jewish voters.
Right. But the reason I asked that question, there's a larger reason for that, because the Asian immigrant in the American immigration narrative has always been presented as a model immigrant.
Right.
He has been quiet. He has not stood up for when other immigrants have been attacked, be it Muslims or Hispanics, and suddenly he's coming under attack now. So this is like, that classic poem by the German pastor, they came looking for me and there was nobody to stand up. Is it that kind of a situation for an Asian immigrant now in America, in Trump's America?
Well, that is certainly the fear. When you compare this Republican administration under Donald Trump to the Republican administration under George W. Bush, it's quite clear that Trump is not willing to put a rein on this within his own party to the extent that George W. Bush was. There are always people who are going to be responsive to this kind of incitement, but I think a lot of people are worried about what the future means for darker-skinned people in the United States. Yeah.
But even amidst all this, there is an argument being made that it's American politics which is polarized and not the American people. Do you subscribe to that point of view?
I think that the American public is pretty polarized, and I've sort of given lots of evidence to support that
Let me supplement
notion.
this, because you spoke about the surveys. The criticism about most of those surveys is that the electorate or the voter or the general public who's asked that question is only given two choices.
Right.
So ideological consistency, which you see when two choices are offered, is being mistaken for polarization, is the critique of these surveys. So do you sort of subscribe to that at all?
Well, we've also seen polarization on particular policy questions.
Issues, right.
So on particular, exact things like, taxation or affirmative action or other kinds of policies. So I think it is a more general phenomenon.
Right. But is there a way the American politics is conducted that is causing polarization? For instance, if I could readily point out two big examples. One is the manner in which primaries are conducted. So if that changes, do you think polarization would uh, be reasonably reduced, and you would sort of allow for a middle to grow. And there is so much of talk about gerrymandering of electoral constituencies. So every 10 years, you try to change the boundaries of electoral constituencies. And the party in power sort of does it to its own advantage. So if something like that is given to a non-partisan group or an election commission like in India, do you think this kind of polarization, this kind of worrisome polarization that we've been talking, can be contained, or the middle can grow?
Well, let me start with gerrymandering.
Okay.
Gerrymandering is an old American tradition. Some of you may know that the term comes from Governor Elbridge Gerry in Massachusetts, who presided over the drawing of a Massachusetts congressional district map that had this irregularly shaped district, and the cartoonist added a beaked head and some wings and some feet and called it a gerrymander. So it is how much gerrymandering has contributed to partisan polarization and to the safety of incumbents. And the overall conclusion of that research is that it's played a role, but it's a fairly small role. Right. And the reason is because there are only so many ways you can draw districts. Right. It isn't a complete blank slate. So gerrymandering is of some importance. Not of extraordinary importance, but it is of some importance. With party primaries, that's a more interesting question, I think. We actually have a live experiment that's running on that right now. There are 2 states that have what are called jungle primaries, where candidates of both parties run in the primary, and then the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party.
Which are the states?
Louisiana is the oldest one. That goes back to the 1980s, and California just adopted it.
I see.
And I guess what I would say about that is that I have not noticed myself that the U.S. representatives from Louisiana are any less polarized than U.S. representatives from other parts of the country. What has happened over time, and this is kind of more into kind of the deeper background of partisan polarization. What's happened over time is that legislative constituencies have become more homogeneous, and it appears that it's largely because of self-segregation, social segregation. So to the extent that partisanship is correlated with race and with income, and to the extent that people self-segregate by race and by income, you end up with a situation where you have more homogeneous congressional districts as a result.
But what will happen if people who have not registered themselves as Democrats or Republicans are allowed to vote during the primaries? Is that a fair process?
Well, in point of fact, in most states already, people who don't have to register by party to participate in a primary, including in Illinois, which has a long history of very strong political parties. In Illinois, you walk in and you say, "I'd like to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary." What you can't do is participate in both. That's the limitation.
Is multi-party politics possible in America at all? Because when you were speaking about, pre-60s or the 50s in America, when the Democrats had both conservatives and liberals within them, it's almost, it resonates the Indian situation where the Congress party had people from the right, from the left, the middle, and all kinds. It was an omnibus kind of a thing. Right. So is a multi-party democracy possible in America at all?
Well, it would take an awful lot of constitutional reform to get a multi-party system. What creates the two-party system in the U.S. Is the single-member constituencies. So, there are 2 senators elected from each state, but they're elected separately. So there's only 1 senator from each state at a time. There's only 1 president. And in congressional districts, by federal law since the 1840s, it's been a requirement there only be 1 representative from each congressional district. So what it would take would be a state or the federal government deciding that you could have multi-member districts. And then you could perhaps get a multi-party system. But getting that at the national level, I think, would be really, really difficult. There have been some states through the years that have been friendly toward multi-member districts, but it would take a lot of constitutional reform to do that.
Okay. I mean, in the backdrop of the Trump election, I know you're from Chicago and all this. You will be in Obama's. You will be kind to him.
He's our neighbor. Yeah.
But then, there was this criticism that the whole Trump election was a reaction to the Obama election. But when Obama was elected in 2008, he gave an impression that he was uniting the country. But why did this happen? Is it fair to criticize Obama for the polarization in American politics today?
No, I don't think it's fair to blame it on Barack Obama any more than it's fair to blame it on George W. Bush or Bill Clinton. I mean, we've seen a 4-decade move in the direction of polarization, and we were as polarized in the George W. Bush administration as we were during the Obama administration. I would say that whatever it is that Obama did to cause polarization in the country was largely because he was a Democrat rather than a Republican. And the same would be true of George W. Bush in the early 2000s. So I don't think it's. I think that aspect of it is kind of the epiphenomenon. It's really.
But don't you think that he also used his executive powers a little too much at the end, and he was also sort of grandstanding on a lot of things, because your colleague David Axelrod in his book Believer.
Yeah.
I think it's at the very end he says if Obama had been more pragmatic, I think things would have been a little more different. I forget the exact lines, but he was always trying to be this idealist and not the pragmatic politician that one should have been to sort of bring people together.
Well, what's interesting about that is that Democrats thought he was too much a pragmatist, that he was trying too hard to work with Republicans and to reach across the aisle. That we got Romney care as Obamacare is kind of one instance of that. Democrats wanted single payer by and large, but instead we got a fairly market-oriented kind of healthcare program. The other thing that was unusual, I guess two other things that were unusual about the Obama administration. The first was that for the first time in my memory, I think the first time ever, we had the leadership of the Republican Party announce that they wanted him to be a one-term president, and announce that they would do anything basically to make him a one-term president. And that's really unprecedented in U.S. history. The second thing that's, I think, a little more disturbing is the role of race and the degree to which the leadership in the Republican Party was kind of willing to play along with people who opposed Obama kind of on racial grounds. If you look at the part of the country where the Republicans made the most gains between 2004 and 2008, it's a band of states that begins in Arkansas and ends in southern Pennsylvania. West Virginia, for instance, and so forth. And so in a lot of ways, it's kind of the last kind of tail end of the partisan realignment that began in the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson embraced civil rights.
Right. Coming back to your slides, Professor Hansen, there was one astonishing slide which is about the election expenditure. And we are talking billions of rupees, billions of dollars. Right. And it's very, very similar in India. I mean, is that something that has also caused polarization in American politics? Because, I think politicians are more loyal to their donors rather than voters. Is that how it is?
Well, actually, when it comes to financial donations, you would actually expect, I think, the influence of financial donations to bring the parties closer together. And there has been that allegation that the Democrats have abandoned kind of true progressive policies because of their dependence upon Wall Street money. I mean, that's out there. Where you see the polarization is the donations that activists make. Right. And, both parties have their activists that keep them, pretty far to the right or pretty far to the left.
Right. Because there's this aspect of business conservatism and social conservatism. And I think within the Republican Party now, Trump has greater social conservatives supporting him than business conservatives supporting him, and they two clash. So, I mean, is state funding of American politics a solution at all? Because we are discussing state funding of politics in India now, at this point of time. Is that an option at all?
Well, I don't think it's a practical political option because I think the Republicans like it just fine.
Right.
And so I just don't see any moves in that direction. The most recent research actually on the effect of the Citizens United decision in 2010, which essentially just opened the floodgates to unlimited campaign contributions, what it suggests is the biggest impact that has had has been on state elections. And it played a huge role in the way that Republicans took over governorships and state legislatures in the 2010 and 2014 elections. In national politics, you know, the two parties are fairly competitive for other reasons, and so the money has a much greater impact, I think, in the lower level elections.
Right. Basically, I mean, there is also a view in the American press. I'm borrowing this from an editorial that was written in the Washington Post, which basically argues that the polarization in American politics has peaked, and things are going to settle down now. And the examples that are given is that there was a Sanders insurgency within the Democrats, and Trump was not completely with the Republican establishment. So they say that there are now 4 divisions and not 2 parties. So is that a bit of hope for American politics?
Well, I would say that there always have been these divisions. That's what you get in a two-party system, is that the parties have to be catch-all.
But was it this open in the past?
Well, in some cases...
Sanders almost sort of,
Yeah, in some cases it was even more open. So the battles between the liberals and the conservatives in the Democratic Party in the 1970s and 1980s, for instance, or the battles in the 1920s between Republican conservatives and progressives. So there have always been those kinds of divisions. If anything, I think they're probably less important now than they were in years past, because there has been this realignment within the parties.
I'll start winding down our conversation. We'll probably throw it open to the audience. Trump has antagonized the American press. He has antagonized the American judiciary. And then he has antagonized more than half of the world. So where does it all go now? Is it
Well, there's clearly 40% of the American public that he hasn't antagonized completely yet. So he's not reached rock bottom quite yet. And I think there are maybe a few nations where he has not insulted or hung up on the nation's leaders. There's been this really weird discussion since Trump was inaugurated about impeachment to begin with. I mean, we're 6 weeks into a new administration, and people are talking about impeachment. And it's possible that something will arise that would be an impeachable offense. If it would turn out that he's $2 billion in debt to the Russians, and that comes to light, that might cause people to think differently about it. Although it would require Republicans thinking differently about it. The other weird thing that's come up has been the invocation of the 25th Amendment, because no American actually remembers what the 25th Amendment says before. It's about presidential incapacitation. And the circumstances under which a president can basically be removed as an administrative matter, and the vice president made the president in the case of...
And that's not a good option to have.
Well, it's... so, it might be clear in instances as in 1920 when Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. And basically wasn't able to function at all as president. This was kept secret. His wife essentially was the president for 8 or 10 months. This is something where, is the guy really crazy or is he not? And so, people will have different opinions about that.
What's your personal view? Is he crazy?
I have never seen I've never seen a national, well, let's put it this way. I've never seen an American leader as self-absorbed as Donald Trump.
That's well stated.
It's just incredible to me how much of everything that happens is about me, and the reactions are about me as opposed to my program or my party or my country. He's very much.
And I think the Association of American Psychiatrists are exploring the whole thing about why this is so.
Yeah,
is that right?
Although, well, no, they're not actually. They adopted, the American Psychiatric Association adopted a policy against kind of armchair diagnosis, and it came about because there were a number of eminent psychiatrists who, in the 1964 election, pronounced Barry Goldwater crazy, and that didn't go over very well. Yeah.
Professor Hansen, with your permission, can we throw the floor open to the audience?
Sure.
Right?
Thank you.
So, questions, please.
How do you explain? You explained election of Trump divergence within the party. There were very good candidates within the Republican Party, and he seems to emerge. Would you like to comment on
We asked this question at the dinner last night, so I didn't repeat it.
that? Well, you didn't invite me.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the general election is kind of once Trump was a Republican nominee, everything just sort of went in the same way that it always goes when you have a Republican nominee and a Democratic nominee. But it does raise the question of how did someone like Trump become the Republican nominee? Both because there was a lot of resistance to Trump among Republican voters and certainly among Republican elites. One little factoid that I like to put out there is that in June, when it was clear that Donald Trump would be the official nominee of the Republican Party, he'd been endorsed by 11 Republican office holders. 11. Hillary Clinton had been endorsed by 267 Democratic office holders. So, there's no love lost between Donald Trump and the Republican leadership in Congress and elsewhere. So I think it comes down to two things, that Trump's ability to win the nomination comes down to two things. One was that Trump was, in fact, the best-known candidate in a very large field. So I showed you some data on favorability. This is a Gallup question where they ask people, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of these public figures? And we actually have a long series on Donald Trump because he's been in the public eye for that long. There are two other response categories. One is, I've never heard of the guy. And the other is, I don't have an opinion. I don't know whether I have a favorable or unfavorable opinion. I don't. Trump had over 90% awareness. That is, people who both knew who he was, and nobody didn't know who he was, right? And people who knew enough about him to say, I like him or I don't, right? And that was 10 percentage points higher than Jeb Bush and 20 percentage points higher than Marco Rubio. So he was the best-known candidate in the field. Within a month of his announcement, he was the front runner. And that was a very, very big step along the way. The other important thing in the Republican primary in 2016 were that there were 17 candidates for the nomination who had either held a high public office, either U.S. representative, U.S. senator, or a governor of a state. So 14 candidates who had previously held public office at a high level, and then 3 national celebrities. Trump, Carly Fiorina, and Ben Carson. So there were 17 candidates. How is it that you knock off a front-runner when you have 17 candidates? You have to have somebody who kind of commands support broadly in the party, maybe not as a first choice, but as a second choice. And it was so fragmented that there wasn't an obvious alternative to Donald Trump. And in fact, it comes down to Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz had no chance whatsoever from the very beginning of winning the nomination. But by that time, everybody around whom the party could coalesce, people like Rubio or Jeb Bush or so forth, they were long gone by that time. So it was a real coordination problem for the opposition to Trump. There were just too many choices.
Interrelated but distinct issues that you were trying to tackle.
Mm-hmm.
It's all right. Okay, it's working. One, of course, was the polarization of American politics. Okay, one is the polarization of American politics, which, as you said, is something which is going on for 30, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is the election of Donald Trump as a president,
Right.
which has to be explained in terms of those 30, 40 years, but also has more immediate
Mm-hmm.
explanation.
Right.
So I like to keep them separate
Okay.
and focus on the first issue. Now, I think one of the things that we didn't mention was how the public sphere has transformed in the last 30, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think rumor and prejudice,
Mm-hmm.
and increasingly lies
Mm-hmm.
and prejudice have begun to play a much more important role in the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And the media has a very important role to play in doing that. And I think there's another issue which has probably not got the attention that it deserves, which is the more you frame a political issue in religious terms
Mm-hmm.
or in moralistic terms, the more you tend to polarize.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think how much what do you have to say on these on how there has been an increasing it's odd to say moralization of politics, because I really do think morality is a force of good, but there's a certain way of moralizing the issue which polarizes it, and I wonder if you have something to say on that.
Right. Well, one of the important drivers of the realignment, the party realignment in the American electorate, was the civil rights revolution in the 1960s. So up until Lyndon Johnson proposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in Congress and in the electorate, there were the more liberal of the two parties on racial issues was the Republican Party. And that was because of the Southern conservatives who opposed civil rights. And so that kind of social issue, you could call it a moral issue, but that kind of social issue played a huge role. And what it meant, and Johnson said at the time he signed the 64 Civil Rights Act, we've lost the South. And so a big part of it was that kind of moral issue. Another thing that clearly played a role in this was the realignment of religious conservatives. I tend to think that realignment was more a consequence of this regional realignment around race than it was an independent factor. But it used to be that the born-again Christians were all Democrats because they were disproportionately in the South. And so, when abortion arose as an important national issue in the 1970s with the Roe versus Wade decision, that also got played out in very partisan ways, and Reagan, in fact, really did played a major role in sort of embracing that social conservative agenda as part of that realignment. So it is the case now that people who go to church a lot are predominantly Republicans, and people who never see the inside of a church are predominantly Democrats. Now, it's also the case, however, that the same kind of alignment in U.S. politics in terms of religious confession has not changed hardly at all over this 50-year period, and that is that the most Republican voters are Protestants, Catholics are more Democratic, and the most Democratic of all are Jews. Right? And the difference between Protestants, Catholics, and Jews in their partisan voting behavior, the difference, they go up and down together, but the difference has stayed almost exactly the same for 50 years. It's really remarkable.
You've talked about the shift in the electorate in the future. How concerned does one have to be that with the likes of Steve Bannon around, there is going to be a real dismantling of the ability of the electorate to really speak for itself? I mean, as it is, you've seen, as you say, gerrymandering, the definite attempts to exclude black voters. Mm-hmm. I think it's a real concern. I wish you'd tell me it isn't.
Well, it certainly is a concern. There have been ups and downs in access to the ballot in the U.S. over a long period of time. there'll be kind of periods of real broadening of the franchise and then periods of retrenchment, and we're in a period of retrenchment now, which actually does follow a period of pretty significant expansion in the ability to vote and the ease of voting. I guess the way I'd put it is this, that I do think it's a concern, and I think in particular that this court is, the Supreme Court, if in fact Mr. Gorsuch, Judge Gorsuch is in fact confirmed, I think this court is pretty likely to uphold many of those restrictions, even against the criticism that Democrats would have. So that's a pretty consequential set of decisions that I think are perhaps before us. On the other hand, the size of this tide is so large that it is going to overwhelm those measures. It will take longer, but it will eventually overwhelm those measures. In the current election cycle, about 14% of the voting age public was Latino. By 2050, it'll be 25%. And along with that, of course, you have this generational replacement where the most Republican parts of the electorate, which voted heavily for Trump, he was kind of the choice of old white guys, right? And the old white guys are going to be gone in 10, 15, 20 years, and they're going to be replaced by a bunch of people who have very different politics and a very different look to them than that generation. So I think that these are measures that are going to sort of hold back the tide, but they're not going to hold back the tide forever.
Last two questions, I think. Yeah, please go ahead.
Mark, notwithstanding the polarization that you're talking about, how much of Trump's election is actually due to the perceived lack of credibility of Hillary Clinton? Mm-hmm. Because she herself got into trouble earlier on, and then the FBI, investigation just before the election. Mm-hmm. So how much of that actually had to do with Trump winning?
Well, I have another talk which I gave at Ashoka a couple of days ago, where I sort of talk about the 2016 election in the context of U.S. presidential elections more generally. And the takeaway point from that is that because of the things that matter year in and year out in presidential elections, one of which is the balance of the two parties in the electorate, economic conditions, and those kinds of factors, 2016 was bound to be a close election, no matter who the candidates were. Now, would a different candidate have done better than Hillary? It's possible that a different candidate could have done better than Hillary, although I would remind everybody in the room that Hillary Clinton actually won the election, per se, right? It was Donald Trump who won the presidency because of the operation of the Electoral College. So this was bound to be a fairly close election. What was the impact of things like, Comey's announcement 10 days before the election that he'd reopened the investigation and the emails and so forth? My interpretation of that is this, that we always see at the end of an election cycle that partisans come home. That is, that there are always people who really don't like the party's nominee and sort of resist supporting that nominee until the very last moment. But at the very last moment, they sort of look at the two choices and they say, well, Hillary Clinton's a Democrat and Donald Trump's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I can't support that Republican, so I'm going to support Hillary Clinton. And we saw exactly that. Where it was most consequential was on the Republican side, where there were a lot of Republicans who were saying, oh my gosh, can I really support this guy? And maybe it was Comey's announcement that led them to say, well, she's a scoundrel too, and so I'll support the lesser of the two scoundrels, and that's Donald Trump. But my contention would be that if Comey's announcement had never occurred, that for most Republicans, they would have found something else to justify to themselves supporting Donald Trump, because in the end, it was really a partisan decision.
Yeah, I'd like to.
There's a question in front. Yeah, the elderly gentleman there.
No.
Yeah. So there's
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
There's polarization and all you talk about, this 40%. In India, we hear reports like a president of one of the biggest democracies telling the judges, "I'll see you in court," and then telling some other few days later that his predecessor is a sick man. Are these things approved by the American public in this polarization game that you're playing? I mean,
Are these things approved? I guess I would say that first of all, this is very unusual. We've never seen a president like Donald Trump. We've never seen someone who is as willing to say something before he thinks about it. We haven't seen anyone who's willing to kind of stick with things even after they've been effectively debunked. He in the middle of the campaign, he finally announced that he had discovered that Barack Obama was in fact born in Hawaii, and it was because of his pressure that this fact was actually established. So there's a kind of level of shamelessness in Donald Trump that we've never seen before. How does the American public react to that? Well, Republicans say, yeah, that sounds like a Barack Obama. Yeah, he could have done something like that. He could have ordered wiretaps of Donald Trump. I can believe that, right? And Democrats who say, "What, are you crazy?" I mean, that's preposterous. Barack Obama would never have done something like that. So one of the unfortunate consequences, I think, of partisan polarization is that people view political events. Here's another case. There are a number of survey organizations that ask people, are you better off or worse off financially than you were a year ago? Right now, if you break that down by party, there are more Democrats than Republicans who say that they are worse off. 6 months ago, it would have been more Republicans than Democrats saying that they are worse off. That is, even in something like that, it doesn't even refer to the president, right? Doesn't refer to partisan politics at all. But people, the partisanship heavily shapes the way that people hear information, the way they evaluate information, and the credibility they attach to it.
Okay, absolutely last question.
Intrigued why America has been having this dual system of voting, popular vote and electoral college.
Right.
Whatever may be the origins, why is it being continued? Is there any possibility at all that you will adopt just the popular? Do you think it will continue forever? That is one. Another small question is, do you really think Putin influenced the result of presidential election? And the tilt towards Trump as it is being reported in so many places.
Right. So on the Electoral College, I've been writing editorials arguing that really the only reform that we should adopt is to have a national popular vote. It will go nowhere. There's no prospect that will ever happen. Part of the reason is because just to get rid of it would require a constitutional amendment. But the other reason is because there have been 4 instances where the popular vote winner and the Electoral College winner were different. In 1876, in 1888, 1888, in 2000 and in 2016. In all 4 instances, the winner in the Electoral College and the loser in the popular vote was a Republican. So this is an institutional arrangement that has only benefited one party. So maybe if this would ever happen, that the Democrats would win in the Electoral College and lose the popular vote, well then maybe there'd be some impetus to change it. But right now, Republicans like this just fine. On the involvement of the Russians in the current campaign, we have a number of federal agencies who've said that There's considerable evidence that the Russians tried to influence the 2016 campaign. I think the main debate is whether they were cooperating with the Republicans and with the Trump campaign in doing that, or whether it was completely independent from the Trump campaign. And that's been what's involved in all these controversies about contacts with the Russian ambassador and so forth. I have no idea about that. The really weird thing to me is that that through all of this, Donald Trump continues to say nice things about Vladimir Putin. Why doesn't he say, I think that he's an autocrat and I'd be opposed to it. But with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, it's all kind of hugs and wet kisses. I mean, it's so figuring out, why would he be so committed to defending Putin and defending the Russians? I don't get it. And I think that's probably what a lot of people who are concerned about this are saying is, well, we're told by Trump that there's no fire there, that it's only smoke, but he refuses to do anything that would lead you to believe that there's no fire there. Instead, he seems to be stoking that fire on a fairly regular basis. So I really have no idea. The thing it has done, however, is that it has caused the standing of Russia in the estimation of Republican voters to go way up. Remember, this was the anti-communist party. You remember that, right? We were anti-Soviet, the Republicans, and now.
Remember what Sarah Palin said.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can see. Yeah, you can see Russia. Yeah, that's why I know so much about foreign policy, and is because you can see Russia from here. So if nothing else, Republicans have changed their attitudes on Russia, and maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't think so. The interesting thing, though, the question, though, I think, is could Bernie Sanders have made enough of a difference in the states that Hillary lost that Obama won, which were these Rust Belt states, to keep the Electoral College from flipping? I think he would have done less well in the popular vote. And you can see the Trump campaign, if Bernie Sanders had been the nominee, commie Bernie, commie Bernie, commie Bernie. That's all we would have heard, right? And so, I don't think that he would have run as well as Clinton.
Thank you, Professor Hansen.
Thank you.
On behalf of Deccan Herald, I thank you for your presentation and discussion. I would request Mr. Tilak Kumar, Joint Managing Director of Printers Mysore and Editor of Deccan Herald, to kindly come on stage and hand over tokens of gratitude to our speakers. Okay, thank you, everyone.